Today we are going to hear from Dr. Kristin Barker. Kristin is the research coordinator for the Beyond Yellowstone program, a new group supporting local conservation efforts with the best available science. She's spent most of the last 2 decades living and working in the Rocky Mountains, hiking, camping, biking, skiing, paddling, and hunting. She has earned her PhD from UC Berkeley, a master's from the University of Montana, and an associate wildlife biologist certification from the Wildlife Society. Kristin has donated her knees to science, having spent years in the field helping study everything from sage grouse to peregrine falcons to alpine butterflies. Her personal research mostly focuses on the behavioral ecology of large terrestrial mammals, especially elk and wolves. When she's not stumbling down a scree field or falling off her mountain bike, you'll probably find her crocheting yet another unnecessary blanket. Seriously, please let her know if you're in need of a blanket. I can also say Kristin has been one of the volunteers on our Absaroka Bat Census project this summer, and her knees held up a lot better than mine did. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Kristin Barker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. This is exciting. Yeah, Corey's knees are terrible. It's getting old. Yeah, like Corey said, I'm the coordinator of the Beyond Yellowstone program, which is based here in Cody, but what I'll be talking to you about today is from my PhD research. And I should probably start by acknowledging that it might seem a little ballsy of me to give a talk about wolves in Cody, Wyoming. That's because when people usually think about wolves, they see them in black and white, typically as one extreme or another. But as an ecologist, when I think about wolves, I think about them in terms of the role that they play in ecosystems. So wolves are one example of an apex predator, and there's been a lot of research on other kinds of apex predators and how they affect ecosystems. So sort of the classic textbook example is the example of the sea otter. So we have found that in areas where sea otters are present, then kelp forests are able to flourish because sea otters eat, better check my notes, I don't know anything about the ocean. The sea otters eat the sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. So by keeping those sea urchins in check, the presence of sea otters helps kelp to grow. Another example that I think is even more fun is largemouth bass function as apex predators in some lakes. And once these sort of important roles of apex predators became evident, some scientists decided that they should just pull all the bass out of half of a divided lake and just see what would happen. And what would happen was a toxic algal bloom that you can see from the air. It's visible in this image. So what happened here was the minnows that the bass usually eat flourished. Those minnows ate all of the zooplankton, and the zooplankton were the thing that were supposed to be keeping the algae in check. So based on research in lots of other areas, we know that apex predators can have important roles in ecosystem structure and function, specifically through how they affect their prey populations. We also know that in a lot of terrestrial ecosystems, apex predators and humans don't always get along. And this can be from their influence not only on prey populations, but also from a perceived kind of human risk problem. And as a case in point, conflict between humans and large predators led to the deliberate extirpation of large terrestrial carnivores, actually not only in this area, but across significant portions of their historic ranges all over the world by the early 1900s. And then in more recent decades, changes in land uses, patterns of what people are doing, and conservation efforts have led to large carnivore populations recovering in actually many areas across the globe. So now these populations are expanding out beyond wilderness, beyond protected areas, and into the places where people live and work and play. So of course now the question on everyone's mind is, how big do we need to build the cages to keep our children safe from the wolves when they wait at the bus stop? It's real. The New Mexico people were a little concerned. No, really the question on everyone's mind is, how are these recovering predator populations affecting populations of their prey? So with the deliberate reintroduction of gray wolves into Yellowstone and parts of central Idaho in 1995, ecologists got this perfect natural experiment in which they could try to understand how a recovering population of predators, specifically wolves, would affect their prey populations and perhaps other aspects of the ecosystem. And I would conservatively estimate that 12.75 bajillion studies have been conducted in the Yellowstone ecosystem trying to answer this question. So after several decades of good concerted study, what have we learned? Well, we have learned that wolves decrease the population size of their prey, sometimes. So after wolf reintroduction, some elk population sizes decreased, others remained stable, and others increased. We have also learned that wolves change the behavior and distribution of their prey, sometimes. So sometimes wolves show up and elk bounce into another drainage. Sometimes wolves show up and elk kind of like give them the side eye and go back to eating. And of course, through these varied influences or not on their prey populations, they may or may not cause trophic cascades. I don't know if any of you have seen this video. It's been widely shared on YouTube and Facebook, but this video tells a very simple story that goes something like this. Once upon a time, there were no wolves. And during that time, prey populations flourished, and they ate a ton of vegetation. That was not great. After wolves were returned, their predatory behavior changed the behaviors or the numbers of their prey, which allowed vegetation to flourish, yada, 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 water table, yada, 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 rivers. And so there have been some studies of this, specifically usually out of Yellowstone National Park, that have found some support for this story. There have also been a lot of studies that have not found support for this story in similar areas. So after all of these decades of trying to understand how predators affect their prey, why do we have all these conflicting results? Of course, there are differences in the landscape among different studies, but that can't be the only thing explaining all this wide variation that we're seeing. One thing that could be going on is that prey should be responding to the actual risk of predation on the landscape, but knowing what predation risk actually is really hard to measure and identify. And so often we don't have that information. So people use proxies like they would consider an open, flat landscape to be a high-risk area, or a place where wolves are maybe going to spend more time as a high-risk area. But we know that those proxies don't always represent the actual risk of an animal dying on the landscape. Another thing that's important to recognize is that humans affect the behavior of predators. There have been studies all over ecosystems, lots of species, including wolves, change their behaviors when they come into contact with humans or when they think they might. So if we want to understand a little more about how predators are affecting their prey across the landscape in a little more informed way, we really need to know how humans are affecting the actual risk of predation on the landscape. This could be happening in one of a few ways. You may have heard of the human shields hypothesis. The idea is that humans decrease the risk of predation because large predators don't hang out where humans hang out. I think this could be happening through one of two mechanisms. Either humans are just disturbing wolves generally by being around. If that's the case, then we would expect to see a lower predation risk close to roads and trails where humans are active, especially during the day when humans are out more. It's also possible that humans would reduce the risk of predation by causing a mortality risk for wolves. And so if that's the case, then we would expect to see a lower risk of predation around human influences, specifically in areas where wolves are hunted by humans. We can also entertain the notion that humans might be increasing the risk of predation. For instance, we provide resources that congregate ungulates in predictable places and times. Ungulates are just members of the deer species. I always try not to use that word, but I always accidentally do, sorry. So when humans provide good food, there's a bunch of prey around for wolves. Maybe they can just capitalize on that. And of course, it's also possible wolves don't care about humans. And if that's the case, then we would expect patterns of predation to be driven just by where prey are available and aspects of the landscape. So we set out to answer this question in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I probably don't need to show you that world map there. You probably know where it's located. Wolves recolonized the area shortly after their reintroduction into Yellowstone. You probably have a feel for what it looks like. It's a big intermountain basin, kind of a developed town area, and some ex-urban developments in the south, and a lot of undeveloped public lands as well. We conducted a study in Jackson during winter specifically for a number of reasons. First of all, winter is when adult elk are most vulnerable to predation because they're starving. It's also when elk are down on those winter ranges that are congregated closest to the human influences that we're trying to understand more about. Conveniently in Jackson, it is cold and it gets dark pretty early, and a lot of the kind of open country is closed ungulate winter range. So we have a pretty good idea of where humans are active because their activities are kind of confined mostly to roads and trails, especially during the day. It has never occurred to me to go snowmobiling up the Gros Ventre in the middle of the night. That would be terrible. Jackson's also very convenient during the winter because we know where ungulate forage is being provided. Elk are fed on the National Elk Refuge, and they're also fed onto state-run feed grounds up in the Gros Ventre River drainage, which is on the Forest Service. Also conveniently, some wolves are hunted in Jackson and others aren't. So wolves in the park and on the elk refuge are not available for hunting. Wolves on the forest are. So we can compare behavioral responses of wolves that have and have not been exposed to hunting. And then the final very convenient thing is that we know a lot about prey availability. The Jackson elk herd is one of the largest and best studied herds in the world. There are about 11,000 individuals in it. The managers are flying transects. They're trying to census the population during the winter. So we have a good relative idea of kind of where there are more and less prey available on the landscape. So we know all of these things that we would like to test the effects of that are related to human influences, and now we just need to figure out what the predation risk is. So to determine this, we launched a simple, straightforward field study in order to understand more about what wolves were killing by actually going out and finding where they were killing things on the landscape. So we did this by using GPS-collared wolves, and we would look at their recent locations, and we did what we call a cluster study, which is basically you find a clump of GPS locations. That's where the wolves are hanging out, and you go there and see if maybe they were eating something while they were there. So we would, as kind of an example, we'd throw these clusters up on a map, and we would go investigate them in the field to see if there was something dead there. If there was, we would perform a necropsy to see if we had physical evidence that wolves had killed that animal, because sometimes they'll just eat stuff that dies. So we did this for 3 winters. We always started in January to avoid overlapping with the wolf hunt that occurs through December. And during that time, we visited more than 1,000 field sites, and we found 170 wolf kills. Most of the sites were beds. Wolves sleep a lot. So after we had done that, we could, if you imagine this kind of red circle is a location where we would find a kill, we could then compare characteristics of places where we found kills to other nearby areas where a wolf could feasibly have killed something during that time but did not. By comparing those characteristics of kill sites and non-kill sites, we could then understand what makes an area more likely to be selected as a kill site relative to other areas. So basically what we were doing was we were figuring out how the probability of a wolf killing something in a certain area changed as a function of environmental influences and human influences. And we tested whether different versions of those things matched what we saw in reality better. And what we found when we did that, number one, was that we explained patterns of predation that we observed significantly better by including human influences in the models. Those always outperformed models that only had environmental influences. Of course, the environmental portion is important too. So we found wolves are more likely to make kills where prey are more available, which is not surprising, especially in thickly canopied areas. They're more likely to make kills in shallow snow and at low terrain positions, so like drainages and valley bottoms, basically. As far as humans, we found evidence for humans both increasing and decreasing the risk of predation, depending on what we were doing. So there was a higher risk of predation near feed grounds, and there was a higher risk of predation near trails. So those are unpaved trails, usually snowmobiles and some ski trails. However, the higher probability of kills occurring during trails was specifically during the nighttime. They were less likely to make kills during the day near trails. And regardless of the time, they were less likely to make kills near roads. So we're already kind of finding some interesting nuances about how humans might affect wolf predation. Something else that we found is that prey availability is a big driver of how wolves respond to humans. So we're going to look at what that looks like in a couple of graphs. So on the y-axis here, you'll see the predicted probability of a wolf kill, from the bottom being not, an animal's not that likely to die, to the top being like, you might die. The x-axis there is the distance to a trail. So the first thing that we see is that there's a higher likelihood of a kill occurring closer to a trail than it is further away. But this specifically happens where prey are readily available, which is indicated by this solid blue line. If we look in areas where prey are scarce, we find a much weaker response to trails, as you can see by that lower slope of the line. When we look at the response to roads, we don't even see a response to roads when prey are scarce. Wolves aren't responding to them at all. But where prey are readily available and wolves can afford to be a little pickier, they do select kill sites that are farther away from roads. So what we're learning from this, number one, is that wolves prioritize acquiring prey over responding to humans. This is important to note because if wolves are expanding into areas where they don't have a good prey base, you might expect more conflict with humans in those kinds of areas because they won't care as much about trying to avoid humans. Another thing that we've learned is that trails and roads have opposite effects on predation risk, which is somewhat surprising because they're both pretty helpful for travel in the snow. There could be a number of reasons for this, and these are just sort of, the guesses that you come up with at the end of your research that you then go test later. So one thing could be the intensity of activity is different. I don't know if you've tried to make a left turn on the highway in Jackson. It's not going to happen. There's different predictabilities of use, and there are some studies that show that animals can kind of pick up on predictable patterns of human behavior. So predictably, like I said, no one's going to be snowmobiling in the middle of the night in negative 20 degrees. But there could be a car maybe at any time, day or night. So wolves may be able to pick up on when they can expect humans to be around or not. It's also possible that maybe wolves are picking up on a mortality risk associated with roads. Vehicle collisions are a cause of mortality for wolves, but again, this would require a lot more further testing. This is sort of just scientific spitballing, I guess. What we do know, what we've seen, is that, of course, environmental characteristics are an important driver of where wolves are killing things on the landscape. But we've documented that you cannot explain patterns of predation nearly as well if you don't include the influence of humans when you're looking at those patterns. We've also found contrasting and even opposite effects of certain human influences, which suggests that wolves aren't just responding to humans themselves, they're actively perceiving and responding to different costs and benefits of human influences. So you can't just kind of paint a broad stroke and say humans will decrease or increase the risk of predation. We've also learned that prey availability, of course, is a really key primary driver of wolf predation, and it acts in conjunction with environmental and human influences in order to kind of drive these patterns of predation. So based on what we've learned then, how does this updated understanding factor into our thinking about the effects of these particular apex predators on the ecosystem? Well, in these Wolf-Elk systems, for this relationship to hold, we have to be able to show that the predatory behavior of wolves affects the feeding behavior of their prey, because that is what will cause a vegetation-driven effect that's hypothesized to cascade through the ecosystem. So we've now kind of characterized the predatory behavior of these predators, including some helpful information about humans, and we can now start to ask how actual predation risk affects the feeding behavior of elk. So there are a few ways that this could happen. One hypothesis is termed the risky places hypothesis. And the basic idea is that you expect an animal to change its behavior based on where it's more or less likely to die. So based on the physical, like the spatial risk underlying them on the landscape. It could also be under the risky times hypothesis that it's not really worth changing your behavior just based on spatial risk. You really only want to change your behavior if you're actually encountering a predator. So, if that's the case, then you would expect behaviors to change specifically when predators are being encountered. There's another hypothesis called the risk allocation hypothesis, which is a little more nuanced, but the basic idea is if you're running away from or otherwise avoiding predators, you're not eating. And ungulates need to eat a lot. And so at some point, if you're constantly exposed to risk, there's just no use bothering to respond to it anymore. The cost isn't worth the benefit. So the prediction of this hypothesis then, which seems counterintuitive but does make sense, is that if you experience a whole lot more risk, you might actually not respond as strongly to that risk. Conveniently, we now have information to test these hypotheses. We know where elk die because we've gone and found those areas on the landscape, and we've used real data to map predation probabilities. We also know when encounters are occurring because in addition to having GPS-collared wolves, we have GPS-collared elk in the same place and time. So we can also use those collars then to look at individual experiences with risk. And so to do that, for each elk, we would look at how much time she spent, what proportion of her time she spent in a risky situation. So in those really risky areas or having a lot of encounters. Then we needed to know how these types of risk might affect the behavior of elk, because that's how we're kind of trying to understand how elk are perceiving these kinds of risks, what it is they're responding to. So the way we did that was we used hidden Markov models to infer what kind of behavior was occurring at each recorded location. So pretty much if we found locations in a relatively straight line with far distances between them, we'd consider that more likely to be a traveling behavior, whereas if they were a little shorter and there was a lot of turning, that was more likely to be a foraging behavior. And then if they were kind of doing nothing, which is also common, then it's a resting behavior. So based on this information then, we could look at each elk location and we could understand what type of behavior she was experiencing, what type of risk she was experiencing, and what type of risk she had experienced overall by looking at all of her data. So we were able to test whether elk were more likely to travel, forage, or rest in risky places, at risky times, or both. And we could also see whether they behaved differently depending on how much risk they generally experienced. What we found was the strongest support for the risky places hypothesis. So elk didn't always change their behavior when they were encountering a wolf, but they were more consistently changing their behavior just based on the underlying risk landscape. And we found that this behavioral response really depended on how much risk an individual typically experienced. So I'll show you one more graph, last one, I promise. Now the y-axis is the predicted probability of a certain behavior. And you're going to see either resting in green, foraging in green for plants, or resting in blue for nighttime, or traveling in orange for not green or blue. And so the x-axis now is the risk of spatial predation. So relatively not that risky on the left to like pretty risky area over on the right. What we see is that elk are, most commonly wanting to forage. That green line is always the highest, but they're less likely to be foraging as they move into more risky areas, and they're more likely to be traveling through those areas. So there's a pretty clear-cut relationship, but interestingly, this is holding true for elk that don't experience risk very commonly. If we look at the same relationship for elk that are experiencing chronic risk, we see a really different pattern of behavior. These individuals seem pretty comfortable just hanging out, foraging and resting, even if they're in a really risky area. So why might elk be hanging out in all of these risky places? Again, this is like the scientific spitballing time in which we think of some explanations that we might be able to test later. One thing is that some individuals might just have higher personal risk tolerance than others. There are actually some studies surprisingly, that quantify like the boldness of different individuals, and they can actually detect differences in elk personalities that affect how they behave. Um, yeah. There's also a possibility that maybe these elk are just prioritizing gaining food over avoiding risk. It's winter, they're hungry, they hang out wherever they can find food. It's also possible, and I wish we could have tested this, that group size plays a role. So, we have just a few collars in the population. We can't tell what size of a group an elk is in at any given time. And if these elk are in a really risky place, but they're in a huge group, their individual risk is actually pretty low, especially if they got like old Bessie limping in the back. So group size could play an important role here. Also, it's really important to note, regardless of why elk are hanging out in risky places, the point is that we see similar behavioral syndromes based on similar individual experiences with risk. But if we don't account for those different individual experiences, all the differences kind of come out in the wash, and we can't see a clear behavioral response. So we know that elk are responding to this spatial predation risk, but if you don't tease out those different types of experiences, then everything just looks like nothing is happening. There's too much variation to detect common behaviors. So this kind of helps us start to understand even more about why there's been so much complexity and why people are finding such different things in different studies. If you're not able to account for an individual's experience with risk, which is actually pretty hard, then you might have difficulty detecting common behavioral responses. And you would also expect that, studies of individuals with different experiences then should produce different results. We found that elk that have less experience with predation risk respond more strongly to it. So, it makes sense that someone studying an elk population that's just experiencing wolves right after reintroduction would find different behaviors than someone studying an elk population that's had wolves around for generations. We've also shown that the type of predation risk that elk respond to most consistently is that spatial, underlying, risky places type of risk. And we found that if you think back to our sort of first vignette, that was driven in part by human influences. So again, if we're looking at places where there are different human influences on the landscape, we would also expect to find different influences of wolves on their prey. So to sort of put all of this together, and see how recovering predators are affecting their prey based on what we know that they will prioritize getting their prey over responding to other influences if food is scarce. So we can think about that in terms of prey, what they'll eat, and also how likely they are to come into contact with humans. We also have shown that humans change patterns of predation, but they don't just change it in one straightforward way. So wolves don't just think of humans as humans. They can really kind of get a detailed understanding of costs and benefits associated with humans, and they respond accordingly. We also found that elk respond to those human influence patterns of predation, but that individual behavior varies a lot. And so overall, we see differences based on food scarcity, based on different types of human influences, based on elk experiences. And so this very clear-cut relationship that has been sort of put forward of wolves affecting elk, affecting vegetation, could absolutely be true in some places and times, but it would be extraordinarily unlikely for it to play out in the exact same way across all of the different places and times in this broad, varied ecosystem that people are looking across. The current body of research, if you look at it all together, just doesn't give super strong support for a very clear cascade of events. So, is the wolf the ecosystem angel that is tirelessly restoring natural processes to their historic things? No. Is the wolf the ecosystem devil that is just eating thousands and thousands of animals and killing things for fun? No. I would like to point out these wolves have to catch like 100-pound animals running full speed using only their mouths, and that's pretty hard. So it's hard for them to get a surplus of animals. We certainly didn't see that when we were out there in the field study. So what are wolves then? Wolves are just another species that has co-evolved in concert with all of the other species that have come together to make up the ecosystems that we live in here today. They're an integral part of those systems, but all in all, they're just another animal trying to survive in a pretty harsh place. So as I take questions, if there's time, I just want to acknowledge that I worked with a bunch of amazing agencies, got a lot of support and funding from a lot of people. None of this would have been possible without that, and I have such a long list of people to thank that I can't possibly thank them all verbally. So I encourage you to read this list very hard while I field any questions you might have if we have time. Yeah, thanks for a reminder. I think your hand was up first in the back. Hi. Yep. We only studied collared cows. Typically, agencies only collar cows because those are the main drivers of population dynamics. Like, you really only need one bull. But I did, during my master's, we collared bulls, and they're so hard on their collars. They fight with each other and they break their collars, and you get no information. So it's pretty hard to study those bulls, and they're not as important to population dynamics. But all of this was on adult females. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yes. Mhm. That's a good question. I have that data here somewhere. It was kind of a spread. There were a lot of yearlings. I would say a higher proportion of young than old. And it was also a lot of really old animals. But there were more like healthy breeding age animals than I would have expected. But usually when we found those, they were in just really gnarly places where the wolves could kind of nail them somewhere. So they're being pretty opportunistic, but yeah, higher proportion of young, I would think. I can look at the numbers and show you later. Yes. It can vary a lot, and I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone know the answer to that? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be repeating the questions. This question was what's the usual ratio of male to female elk? Which, yeah, I should know that, and I don't. I'm gonna find out. Thanks for asking. More questions? Oh, yes.
So you've completed this work for your PhD work. Are you doing anything today that relates to elk or wolves or the greater Yellowstone landscape? And if so, what might that be?
Corey is asking if I do anything related to elk, wolves, and the GYE today. I do some. Our research collaborative is relatively new, and as the coordinator, mostly what I'm doing right now is talking to people and figuring out work that needs to be done on the landscape. So as much as I'd love to like do whatever I want to, most of my work is defined by things that need to be done just for applied purposes. But I am also working with folks to do additional research projects on things like how fences affect ungulate movement and changes in elk behavior through time, and lots of other fun things that I think are interesting. Yes? Do I have an estimate of how many wolves are in the study area? We do, but it changed a lot every year and within years. So let's see, the lowest year we probably had, maybe like 3 or 4 solid packs. And then that ranged up to like 6. Sometimes packs would be as big as 12 to 15. Sometimes they were only 2 to 3. It varied a lot depending on how the hunting season went the previous year and how much they killed each other, because there's a lot of wolves fighting wolves all the time. Yes? What inspired me to begin this kind of study? Mostly folks in Jackson were trying to figure out what was going on with elk there. Um, I've told you that there are state feed grounds up in the Grovant River drainage. There was one winter when all the elk left the Grovant, even though there was food actively being provided to them. And my master's work was all about elk migration and nutrition. And this just blew my mind that you'd have a bunch of elk walking right past fresh food that's been put out, and no one really understood why that was. And some people thought it was because of snow. It was a really low snow year. Some people thought it was because of food differences. Some people thought it was because of wolves. And the data that we didn't have was about wolves. And so mostly like the park and the state were really interested to know more about what wolves were doing on the landscape. So that's kind of what started this whole thing. Oh, prior to my master's. Oh, no, I didn't know that she's asking like as a child, how did I decide? I didn't know that wildlife ecology was a thing. I didn't know that public land was a thing. I grew up on the East Coast. My first degree was in English, and then I moved out to the mountains. And long story short, I was volunteering for this program because I was a program manager in a software company, and I had this nice office, and I could just see the mountains right outside my office, and it was terrible, and my soul was slowly dying. And I came to learn that you could learn about natural systems, and you could spend time outside, and you could be involved in the natural world and also be using your brain. And I went back to school for longer than I would care to admit, and I'm finally done. Yes. Yep. Perfect. Ah, yes. There's a question about whether there are studies of wolf populations nearby. There are. They're being done by a woman named Avery Schaller, who is too busy finishing her dissertation to speak with you at this time. But she did a similar study, the cluster study looking at mortalities, but she's done it for 3 years during winter and summer. And she's looking at how elk migration changes patterns of wolf predation. And she's finding some pretty cool stuff. Yes. Okay. Hmm. Do I see a possibility of the elk population spiraling and forgetting how to migrate in the future based on the like all the pressures, including wolves and chronic wasting disease? I love that question because I'm actually an elk migration researcher, and I just kind of like ended up having to do some wolf stuff for a while. Um, it's it would be surprising if elk completely forgot how to migrate, but they need to retain that older age class of individuals. Um, there is a fair amount of evidence of elk can change behaviors every year. So sometimes like an elk could migrate one year, and then the next year she's like, I think I'm gonna hang out. And then the next year she's like, oh no, that was great, I'm gonna go back. So their behaviors are really variable. They change where they migrate, they change when they migrate. And so there is a lot of kind of cultural knowledge that's held in those elk herds. And if you still have that cultural knowledge, then, if there are these environmental triggers that they're responding to, the lead cows will kind of know what to do. But there are a lot of instances of migration being reduced, even especially not especially, but also in the Cody area, but everywhere really across the West. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to test that human shield hypothesis, because one of the thoughts is elk are hanging out and they're not migrating because there's lower predation risk near humans. But no, I wouldn't expect them to completely forget how to migrate as long as those areas are still open for them to migrate, and as long as there's still a benefit of migration. Does that answer your question? Okay. Oh, yes. Yes, wolves were brought from Canada. That's a good question. What's the Canadian experience with wolves? A friend of mine studies wolves in Alberta. They have very liberal harvest of wolves. They don't really like keep track of the population very much. And she did a whole bunch of modeling to understand things and basically found out that like wolves are still around. So in Canada, they're just sort of, they've just been there. They've been part of the ecosystem. There's not really like a weird special thing that's happening there relative to here. Are there like certain things? Are the populations larger? It just depends on the areas and like what food they have. It's kind of similar to here. Yes. Oh wow.
And we have a lot of moose.
Mm-hmm.
The moose population has greatly declined in that area.
Yep.
We felt landowners because of the reintroduction of the wolves.
Ah.
Do you have any statistics on that at all?
Do I have statistics on the effect of wolves on moose populations that are doing pretty poorly in a lot of areas? We didn't have a bunch of moose collared. A lot of the moose that are collared around Jackson are like in town or in moose actually. But we did find moose mortalities at our sites. It was the second most common. So 87%, I think, of the kills were elk, and maybe 8 to 10% were moose. So we did find moose kills, but moose are kind of hard to collar. They overheat really easily. So if you chase them, it's a whole thing. They're just harder to work with. And so there's been a lot less work on how their actual population dynamics are being affected. And it could have to do with, elk movement patterns changing. And but yeah, we would think that we would know when we were going to find a wolf kill because it was of a moose, because it'd be in like just really thick kind of like when the moose kills that I found were like super opportunistic. Like they happened to be able to get a moose in a really crappy area, or like the snow was just crazy soft and the moose obviously couldn't stay up. But so they do kill moose, but I'm not sure about, we don't have evidence that they are the cause of population declines, but we don't have evidence that they're not. Sorry if that's unhelpful.
One thing on moose.
Yes.
So if you've gone through the Draper recently, there is a really phenomenal display on moose that talks about there's no single cause of decline for moose. Some areas within Wyoming alone, they are increasing in population. Some areas they're decreasing. But they are, as Kristin mentioned, very thermal sensitive to heat stress. They need a lot of optimum foraging habitat and very susceptible to climate change. So also parasites, they get carotid worm arteries, meningeal brain worms. They get ticks by tens of thousands. All these parasites will weaken the immune system, weaken their ability to respond to different stresses, whether that's predatory, habitat stress, or thermal stress. So there's a lot of conflicting factors. So it's not just one single thing, but oftentimes it's these different conflating factors working in concert that can make it really difficult for an animal of that caliber to be able to adapt to expanding pressures. Sorry, thank you.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. We did find some of those moose kills were pretty bad with winter ticks. Like you just see dots of blood in their bed because they would just when they were laying down. There's a lot going on there. More questions? Let me
Dr.
off the
Barker,
hook.
thank you for your time.
Thank you all.